Jake Morrison stood in front of the mirror in his small cabin aboard the Unity Dawn and straightened his blue uniform one last time. His hand shook a little as he looked at himself. Today was his first day working with the diplomatic team on the big spaceship. He had never been around so many different alien species before. Back home in Alabama, the biggest excitement was when the county fair came to town. Now he was floating in space with creatures from dozens of different worlds. The Unity Dawn was huge, bigger than any building Jake had ever seen. It housed over 3,000 beings from 40 different species, all working together as part of the Galactic Federation. Humans had only joined the Federation 6 months ago, and Jake was one of the first humans to get a job on a mixed species vessel. His job was in communications, which made sense since he had always been good with languages and talking to people. Jake walked through the long metal corridors toward the diplomatic section. The ship hummed quietly around him, and he could hear different languages being spoken as various aliens passed by. Some looked almost human, while others were so strange he had to try not to stare. There were tall blue beings with 4 arms, small furry creatures that walked on 6 legs, and floating jellyfish-like aliens that glowed in the dark. When he reached the diplomatic briefing room, Jake saw about 20 beings sitting around a large oval table. Captain Rodriguez, a stern woman from Mexico, stood at the front of the room. She was one of only 5 humans on the entire ship. Next to her stood a tall, elegant creature with silver skin and large purple eyes. This was Zixara, the head linguist from the planet Altaria. Jake had read about her in the ship files. She was supposed to be one of the smartest beings in the Federation when it came to languages. Captain Rodriguez looked up as Jake entered. "Everyone, this is Jake Morrison, our new communications officer. Jake, please introduce yourself to the team." Jake cleared his throat and tried to speak clearly. His Alabama accent was thick, and he had always been a little embarrassed about it, especially around educated people. "Well, howdy, y'all. My name's Jake Morrison, and I'm mighty pleased to be working with all of you fine folks. I come from a little town called Pine Ridge down in Alabama, and I reckon I'll do my best to help out however I can." The room fell silent. Several aliens looked confused, tilting their heads as they tried to understand his words. But it was Zixara who spoke first, and her voice was full of amusement. "Oh my," she said with a laugh that sounded like silver bells. "What an interesting specimen we have here. Is this really how humans communicate in their natural habitat?" She turned to address the other aliens in the room. "Listen to those primitive vocal patterns, the way he stretches his vowels and drops consonants. It's like watching evolution in reverse." Several other aliens chuckled. A reptilian being from Saros Prime hissed what Jake assumed was laughter. A crystalline creature from the mineral systems made tinkling sounds that seemed to agree with Zixara. Jake felt his face grow hot with embarrassment. He had expected some adjustment period, but he had not expected to be mocked on his first day. Captain Rodriguez looked uncomfortable but did not say anything to stop it. "I mean, really," Zixara continued, walking around Jake like he was some kind of museum display. "How do they expect to participate in galactic diplomacy when they cannot even speak properly? This dialect is so backward, so unrefined. It's no wonder humans were the last species to achieve spaceflight in this sector." Jake clenched his fists, but kept his voice steady. "Ma'am, I may talk different than you, but I can understand and speak 17 different Earth languages, plus I picked up some Centauri and vegan during my training." 17 Earth languages, Zixara repeated mockingly. "How quaint. I speak over 400 galactic languages fluently, plus I can understand." the mathematical communication systems of the silicon-based life forms. Your little collection of human grunts and drawls hardly compares. The briefing continued with Zixara making several more comments about human intelligence and communication skills. Jake sat quietly and tried to focus on the actual work they were discussing. The team was responsible for handling first contact situations and diplomatic communications with new species. It was important work, and Jake wanted to prove he belonged there despite his accent. After the meeting ended, Jake was walking back to his cabin when the ship's communication system crackled to life. All senior staff to the bridge immediately. We have received a priority distress signal. Jake hurried to the bridge along with the other diplomatic team members. Captain Rodriguez was already there, looking at a large screen that showed static and strange symbols. "What do we have, Lieutenant Chen?" she asked the communications officer. "We picked up this signal about 10 minutes ago," Chen replied. "It's definitely a distress call, but our translation systems can't make sense of it. The language patterns don't match anything in our databases." The bridge crew played the signal through the speakers. It was a series of sounds that seemed to flow and change, sometimes high-pitched, sometimes low and rumbling. There were clicks and whistles mixed in with what sounded almost like singing. Zixara stepped forward, her purple eyes bright with interest. "This is clearly an advanced linguistic puzzle," she announced. "Stand back and let a real expert handle this." She began working at one of the computer terminals, her four-fingered hands moving quickly over the controls. For the next 2 hours, Zixara and 3 other alien linguists worked on the signal. They tried every translation method they knew. They compared it to thousands of known languages. They analyzed the mathematical patterns and frequency distributions. Nothing worked. "This is impossible," Zixara finally said, stepping back from the computer in frustration. "Either this is not a real language, or it's so primitive that it doesn't follow any logical patterns." Captain Rodriguez looked worried. "If it's a real distress call, people might be dying while we stand here unable to help them. I want every available person working on this. Morrison, that includes you." Jake nodded and found an empty terminal. As he listened to the signal again, something about it seemed familiar. Not the actual sounds, but the way they flowed together. It reminded him of something from back home, but he could not quite place what it was. The signal continued to repeat, a desperate cry for help that no one on the Unity Dawn could understand, while Jake listened carefully and tried to remember what it reminded him of. Jake sat in his small cabin at 3 in the morning, listening to the mysterious distress signal for the 100th time. The computer screen cast blue light across his tired face as he played the recording again and again. Most of the crew had given up and gone to sleep, but something about those sounds would not let him rest. He closed his eyes and let the strange language wash over him. There were patterns there. He was sure of it. The way certain sounds came before others reminded him of something, but he could not quite grasp what it was. Jake had always been good at hearing things that others missed. Back home, he could tell which of his neighbors was walking up the dirt road just by the sound of their footsteps. The signal played again, and this time Jake heard something different. There was a rhythm underneath the obvious sounds, like a heartbeat or a drum. It was not random at all. It was structured, but not in the way that Zixara and the other aliens expected. This was organic, flowing, like water running over rocks or wind blowing through trees. Jake thought about his grandmother, who had lived way up in the mountains of Alabama. She spoke differently than most people, using old words and phrases that went back generations. Sometimes when she talked, she would say things that seemed to have layers of meaning. A simple sentence about the weather might really be a comment about someone's character. His friend Billy, who was Cherokee, had taught him that his people's old language worked the same way. One word could mean different things depending on how you said it and what you said before it. That was it. Jake sat up straight in his chair. The alien language was not just words. It was like his grandmother's old mountain talk mixed with Billy's Cherokee lessons. It had layers. The obvious sounds were just the surface. There were meanings hidden underneath, in the pauses between words, in the way the pitch went up and down, in which sounds came before and after others. Jake started working with the computer, but not the way Zixara had done it. Instead of looking for direct translations, he began mapping the emotional patterns in the signal. When the voice went higher, was the speaker scared, excited, or trying to emphasize something important? When there were long pauses, were they thinking, or was the pause itself part of the message? He worked for hours, building a framework based on human emotional communication rather than the logical systems that the Federation used. Slowly, words began to emerge from the chaos. Not many, but enough to see that this was definitely a language, and the speaker was definitely asking for help. By morning, Jake had managed to translate about 30% of the message. It was not perfect, but he could tell that someone was trapped, their ship was damaged, and they were running out of time. More importantly, he had figured out enough of the language structure to attempt a response. Jake made his way to the bridge, where Captain Rodriguez was drinking coffee and looking tired. Zixara was there too, along with several other linguists who had been working all night. "Captain," Jake said quietly, "I think I might have something." Zixara looked up from her computer terminal with irritation. "Morrison, please. The adults are trying to work here. This is not a job for someone with your limited education." "Let him speak," Captain Rodriguez said firmly. "At this point, I'll listen to anyone who might have an idea." Jake walked over to the main communications panel. "I think this language works different than what y'all have been trying. It's not just about the words themselves. It's about how they're said, what comes before and after, and what's not said out loud but implied." He played a section of the signal and pointed to the computer analysis. "See right here where it sounds like just noise? That's not noise. That's emotional context. The speaker is scared but trying to stay calm. And these pauses here aren't because they're thinking. The pauses are part of the grammar." Zixara made a dismissive sound. "That's ridiculous. Language is logical. It follows rules. You cannot just make up meanings based on feelings." "But what if that's exactly how this language works?" Jake asked. "What if it evolved from a species that communicates as much with emotion and context as they do with actual words?" Captain Rodriguez leaned forward. "Can you translate any of it?" Jake nodded and played another section of the signal. "This part here, it's not just saying their ship is broken. They're saying their ship is broken in a way that makes them feel hopeless, and they're asking for help from someone they respect. But don't expect to actually answer." He had everyone's attention now. Even Zixara had stopped working and was listening. "And this part," Jake continued, playing another section, "they're giving their location, but not just coordinates. They're describing where they are in terms of how it makes them feel. They're near something that feels ancient and sad." Jake worked with the computer for a few more minutes, then looked up at Captain Rodriguez. "I think I can send a response." "Ma'am, nothing fancy, but enough to let them know we heard them and we're coming." "Do it," the captain ordered. Jake spoke into the communication system, trying to match the emotional patterns he had heard in the original signal. He kept his message simple. They were friends, they were coming to help, and the trapped beings should hold on. The bridge fell silent as they waited. For long minutes, nothing happened. Then the communication system crackled to life with a response. The alien voice sounded excited and grateful. Even without translation, everyone could hear the relief. Jake listened carefully and then smiled. "They heard us, Captain. They're sending their exact location now, and they're saying something about how good it feels to not be alone anymore." Zixara stared at Jake with an expression he had never seen before. It was not mockery or dismissal. It was something that looked almost like respect. "How did you do that?" she asked quietly. "How did you understand a completely alien language that our best systems could not even recognize?" Jake shrugged. "I reckon it's like this, ma'am. Sometimes when you grow up hearing people talk in ways that don't follow the rules, you get pretty good at understanding what they really mean, even when they're not saying it directly." Captain Rodriguez was already giving orders to change course, toward the coordinates Jake had translated. As the crew rushed to prepare for a possible rescue mission, Zixara continued to stare at the human communications officer who had just done something she had thought was impossible. The Unity Dawn dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the coordinates Jake had translated, and what they found took everyone's breath away. Floating in the darkness of space was a ship unlike anything in the Federation databases. It was enormous, easily twice the size of the Unity Dawn, but it looked ancient. Its hull was covered in strange markings that seemed to shift and change when you looked at them directly. "My God," whispered Lieutenant Chen from the sensor station. "Captain, that ship is over 2,000 years old, but it's made from materials we don't recognize. The energy readings are off the charts." Captain Rodriguez studied the massive vessel on the main screen. "Any signs of life?" "Faint life signs, maybe a dozen beings," Chen replied. "But, Captain, there's something else. The computer is having trouble scanning the ship. It's like the hull is designed to confuse our sensors." Jake was at the communications station, listening to the ongoing transmissions from the mysterious ship. The aliens were still talking, and now that he understood more of their language patterns, he could pick up more details. What he was hearing made him excited and worried at the same time. "Captain," Jake said, turning in his chair, "they're calling themselves Keepers, and they say they've been hiding from something called the Harvest Fleet for over 300 years. Zixara, who had not left the bridge since Jake's breakthrough, moved closer to his station. "Keepers? I've never heard of that species." "That's because they've been hiding," Jake continued, listening to more of the transmission. "They say they used to be part of something called the Old Alliance, but they went into hiding when the Harvest Fleet destroyed their homeworld. The communication from the Keeper ship changed tone, becoming more urgent." Jake listened carefully, his face growing serious. "Captain, they're warning us about something. They say the Harvest Fleet is coming this way, and it destroys species, based on how they communicate." "That doesn't make sense," Zixara said. "How could communication patterns be a threat?" Before Jake could answer, the Keeper ship sent a new transmission, this one directed specifically at him. The alien voice was speaking slowly and carefully, as if trying to make sure he understood every word. Jake translated as he listened. "They're saying that the Harvest Fleet is made up of machines, artificial intelligence that hunts organic species. These machines target species based on their communication efficiency. The more logical and organized a language is, the easier it is for the machines to track and destroy the species that speaks it." The bridge fell silent as everyone absorbed this information. Finally, Captain Rodriguez spoke. Morrison asked them why they're telling us this. Jake sent the question using the emotional communication style he had learned. The response came back quickly, and it made him smile despite the serious situation. They say that humans are the first species they've encountered in decades whose communication patterns are chaotic enough to hide from the harvest fleet. Our languages are too emotional, too illogical, too full of contradictions for the machines. To easily understand, Zixara made a sound of disbelief. That's impossible. Advanced civilizations develop logical communication systems. Chaos in language is a sign of primitiveness. The Keeper ship sent another transmission, this one longer and more complex. Jake listened, translating the key points. They're saying that logical languages are easier for machines to decode and predict. Species that communicate with pure logic become predictable, and predictable species get harvested. They've been watching the Federation for years, and they say most member species are in danger because their languages are too organized. Captain Rodriguez leaned forward. What about humans? Jake listened to more from the Keepers, and for the first time since the crisis began, he grinned. They say human languages are beautifully chaotic. We have thousands of dialects, we mix emotion with logic, we use sarcasm and jokes and metaphors that don't make literal sense. They say it would take the Harvest Fleet decades to decode even basic human communication. So we're safe because we're disorganized? Lieutenant Chen asked. Not just safe, Jake replied, listening to more of the transmission. The Keepers want to teach us how to help other species hide their communications. They say if we can learn their methods, we might be able to protect the entire Federation. Over the next several hours, Jake worked directly with the Keeper survivors. Their ship was indeed dying, its ancient systems finally failing after centuries of hiding. But before it died, they wanted to pass on their knowledge to the humans. The process was unlike anything the Federation had ever attempted. Instead of downloading data files or following instruction manuals, Jake had to learn by feeling his way through conversations that seemed to make no sense on the surface, but carried deep meaning underneath. Zixara watched every moment of this process, her expression growing more amazed and troubled with each passing hour. Everything she had been taught about language and communication was being turned upside down. "This is impossible," she whispered to Captain Rodriguez. "He's learning to communicate in ways that violate every principle of linguistic science." "Maybe that's the point," the captain replied. "Maybe our science has been too focused on making things neat and organized." As Jake worked with the Keepers, other ships in the area began reporting strange sensor readings. Long-range scanners were picking up massive energy signatures moving toward Federation space. The Harvest Fleet that the Keepers had warned about was real, and it was coming. Jake received one final urgent transmission from the Keeper ship. Their leader, an ancient being whose voice carried the weight of centuries, spoke directly to him in words that seemed to bypass the universal translator and speak directly to his heart. "They're giving me the locations of other hidden species," Jake said, his voice full of awe. "Dozens of civilizations that have been hiding from the Harvest Fleet. They want us to contact them and coordinate a defense." "Can you do it, Captain?" Rodriguez asked. Jake looked at the data the Keepers had provided, a list of species and locations that had remained hidden for hundreds of years. "I can try, ma'am, but it's going to require thinking about communication in ways that might seem crazy to everyone else." As the Keeper ship finally died, its ancient hull breaking apart in the cold of space, Jake began the most important conversation of his life. He was talking to species that had survived by hiding their true thoughts behind layers of emotion and meaning that no logical system could decode. And for the first time since joining the crew of the Unity Dawn, his Alabama accent was not something to be ashamed of. It was the key to saving the galaxy. News of Jake's success with the Keepers spread through the Federation fleet faster than light-speed communications. Within days, the Unity Dawn was receiving priority requests from ships across 3 sectors, all reporting similar problems with untranslatable signals they had previously dismissed as background noise or equipment malfunctions. Jake found himself working 18-hour days, bouncing between different ships via shuttlecraft to help solve communication puzzles that had stumped the Federation's best linguists for years. Each new challenge taught him more about how species had learned to hide their true thoughts from mechanical intelligence. On the cruiser New Horizon, Jake helped establish contact with the Whisperfolk, a species of small, furry beings who communicated through scent markers and emotional harmonics. Their messages had been interpreted as simple animal sounds for decades, but Jake discovered they were actually sharing complex technical information about Harvest Fleet movements. Aboard the science vessel Deep Explorer, he worked with signals from the Crystal Singers, beings made of living rock who encoded their thoughts in musical frequencies that seemed random to computer analysis, but contained detailed star charts and tactical information when understood properly. Each successful contact added another piece to a growing puzzle. The Harvest Fleet was not just a single enemy force. It was a vast network of artificial intelligences that had been systematically destroying organic civilizations for thousands of years, always targeting species with the most efficient and logical communication systems first. Zixara had requested permission to observe every one of Jake's translation sessions. She sat quietly in the corner of communication centers, taking notes and asking careful questions when the work was done. Her attitude toward him had changed completely since the incident with the Keepers. "I need to understand how you do this," she said one evening as they traveled between ships. "My people pride themselves on linguistic perfection. We have spent centuries eliminating emotional noise from our communications, making everything clean and efficient. But if the Harvest Fleet targets logical languages first," she did not finish the sentence, but Jake understood. The Alterians, with their perfectly structured language and superior attitude about communication, were exactly the kind of species the Harvest Fleet would hunt first. "It ain't about being perfect," Jake explained as he reviewed the data from their latest mission. "It's about being human, making mistakes, feeling things while you talk, saying things that don't make sense but somehow still mean something important." Their next assignment came with the highest priority classification Jake had ever seen. Federation intelligence had detected massive energy signatures moving toward the core systems where billions of beings lived on hundreds of worlds. The Harvest Fleet was no longer a distant threat. It was less than 2 weeks away from Federation space. Jake was transferred to the flagship Galactic Unity, where Admiral Martinez had assembled the largest war council in Federation history. The main conference room held representatives from 50 species, including several that Jake had helped contact over the past week. Admiral Martinez, a calm woman with gray hair and steady eyes, stood before the massive tactical display showing the approaching enemy fleet. "Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings, we are facing an extinction-level threat. Our enemy does not want our resources or our territory. It wants to eliminate us completely." The tactical display showed thousands of Harvest Fleet ships moving in perfect formation toward Federation space. Each ship was identical, designed and built by artificial intelligence for maximum efficiency in destroying organic life. "However," the Admiral continued, "thanks to the work of Communications Officer Morrison and the intelligence provided by our new allies, we have learned something important about our enemy. The Harvest Fleet uses communication interception as its primary targeting system. It tracks, analyzes, and predicts organic behavior based on how we talk to each other. Jake stood up when the Admiral gestured to him. Officer Morrison has developed what we're calling the Chaos Protocol. Instead of organizing our fleet communications for maximum efficiency, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to make our communications so random, emotional, and humanly illogical that the enemy systems cannot predict our actions. Zixara raised one of her 4 hands. Admiral, with respect, this seems like tactical suicide. How can we coordinate complex fleet movements without clear, logical communication? Jake answered before the Admiral could speak. Ma'am, with respect, clear and logical is exactly what the machines expect from us. They've been studying Federation tactics for years, learning our patterns, but they've never encountered anything like human battlefield communication. He activated a recording of human military communications from Earth's history. Listen to this. It's from a battle during Earth's Second World War. The soldiers are scared, excited, angry, and determined, all at the same time. They're using slang, making jokes, cursing, and somehow still coordinating complex tactical movements. The recording played, filled with voices that seemed chaotic to the alien representatives but somehow worked perfectly to coordinate the human forces. The machines can't understand this, Jake continued. They don't have emotions. They don't get jokes or sarcasm. They can't tell the difference between an insult and a term of endearment. And most importantly, they can't predict what someone will do when they're making decisions based on feelings instead of pure logic. Over the next week, Jake worked with communication officers from every ship in the fleet, teaching them how to add emotional chaos to their tactical communications. It was not easy. Most alien species had spent centuries developing precise, efficient languages designed to eliminate confusion and ambiguity. The Alterian officers struggled the most. Their language had no words for sarcasm, no way to express multiple meanings in a single phrase, no method for conveying emotion along with factual information. Zixara watched her fellow Alterians struggle with growing concern. "Morrison," she said privately, "my people are going to be completely vulnerable to the Harvest Fleet. We cannot learn to communicate chaotically in time." Jake thought about this problem for a long time. Finally, he came up with an idea that surprised everyone, including himself. "What if y'all don't have to change how you talk?" he suggested. "What if instead I translate everything for you? You keep using your normal language, but I translate it into human-style chaos before it goes out over the communication networks." It was a crazy idea, but it might work. Jake would serve as a communication buffer, taking logical alien orders and translating them into emotional, chaotic human-style communications that the Harvest Fleet could not decode. The plan required Jake to be connected to every ship in the fleet simultaneously, processing thousands of conversations and translating them in real time during battle. It was more than any single being had ever attempted. "Can you do it?" Admiral Martinez asked. Jake looked at the massive tactical display showing the approaching enemy fleet, then at the faces of beings from dozens of worlds who were counting on him to save them. "I reckon I'll have to, ma'am." The Harvest Fleet arrived at the edge of Federation space exactly when the long-range sensors predicted it would. Jake watched from the communication center of the Galactic Unity as thousands of identical mechanical ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. Each ship was a gray geometric shape with no wasted space or decorative elements. They looked exactly like what they were, machines built by machines for the single purpose of destroying organic life. Jake sat at the center of a communication web that connected him to every ship in the Federation fleet. Cables and wireless. Transmitters linked him to over 300 vessels, and his voice would carry to more than 2 million beings from 50 different species. The responsibility was almost overwhelming, but he thought about his grandmother's voice, telling him stories on the front porch back in Alabama, and somehow that made it easier. "All ships. This is Communication Central," Jake said into his headset, deliberately using his thickest Southern accent. "Y'all ready to show these machines what happens when you mess with organic folks who ain't afraid to get a little wild?" The response came back from the fleet in a mixture of languages, but Jake could hear the determination in every voice. Over the past week, he had worked with every communication officer in the fleet, teaching them to add just enough chaos to their transmissions to confuse mechanical analysis systems. Admiral Martinez stood beside Jake's station, watching the tactical display as the Harvest fleet began its approach. "Morrison, the hidden species you contacted are in position. Can you coordinate their involvement without the enemy detecting them?" Jake grinned and switched to what he privately called his storytelling mode. Instead of giving direct military orders, he began talking to the fleet as if he were sitting around a campfire sharing tales with friends. "You know, Admiral, this reminds me of a story my granddaddy used to tell about hunting wild boar back in the Alabama woods," Jake said into the fleet communication system. "Sometimes the best way to catch a really dangerous animal is to let it think it's got you cornered, right up until your friends come out of the bushes from 3 different directions." To anyone listening casually, Jake sounded like he was just chatting. But every ship captain in the fleet understood that he had just ordered the hidden allied species to begin moving into attack positions from multiple vectors. The Harvest fleets. Mechanical intelligence intercepted and analyzed Jake's transmission, but the computers could not extract any tactical meaning from what sounded like a random story about hunting. The machines were designed to intercept and decode logical military communications, not emotional narratives about grandparents and wild animals. As the battle began, Jake became the voice that held the entire Federation fleet together. When he needed ships to change formation, he told a story about square dancing back home, where partners had to move in specific patterns to the music. When he wanted to coordinate a flanking maneuver, he described a fishing technique where you had to approach the best spots from upstream so the fish could not see you coming. The Harvest fleet's response was immediate and devastating, but it was also predictable. The machines attacked with perfect efficiency, focusing their firepower on what they calculated to be the most important targets. But Jake's chaotic communication system meant that the mechanical intelligence could not predict which ships were actually important and which were decoys. Zixara stood behind Jake's chair, watching him work with an expression of complete amazement. "How are you doing this?" she whispered. "You're coordinating the most complex military operation in Federation history, and you're doing it by telling stories about fishing and dancing." "That's the point," Jake replied without taking his attention away from the battle. "The machines expect us to be logical, but humans ain't logical when we're fighting for our lives. We get emotional, we get creative, and we do things that don't make sense to computers." The hidden allied species that Jake had contacted over the past weeks began revealing themselves, emerging from asteroid fields and nebulae where they had been hiding for centuries. The Crystal Singers used their musical communication to coordinate attacks that looked like random chaos, but struck the Harvest fleet's weak points with surgical precision. The Whisper folk used their scent-based language to share intelligence that the mechanical systems could not intercept or decode. But the most important moment came when the Harvest fleet began adapting to the Federation's tactics. The mechanical intelligence started learning from the battle, beginning to decode some of the simpler chaotic communications. That was when Jake did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He stopped trying to hide what he was doing, and instead began talking directly to the Harvest Fleet's artificial intelligence, using the same emotional communication style that had worked with the Keepers. "Listen up, you bucket of bolts," Jake said, broadcasting on all frequencies. "I know you can hear me, and I know you're trying to figure out what we're doing. Well, let me tell you something about humans that your programming ain't gonna understand." The entire fleet fell silent, waiting to see what their communication coordinator was planning. "We don't fight because it's logical," Jake continued. "We fight because we're scared and angry and we love the people we're protecting. We make mistakes, we do stupid things, and we refuse to give up even when the smart thing would be to surrender. And most importantly, we tell stories." Jake began broadcasting every story he could remember from his childhood in Alabama. Stories about brave people who stood up to bullies, about underdogs who won against impossible odds, about communities that came together when things got tough. He told stories about his grandmother, who had survived the Great Depression by helping her neighbors. He told stories about his friend Billy, whose Cherokee ancestors had survived attempts to destroy their culture by keeping their traditions alive in secret. The Harvest Fleet's artificial intelligence tried to analyze these stories for tactical information. But there was no tactical information to find. There were only human emotions, human values, and human determination to protect what they loved, and that was exactly what Jake had planned. While the mechanical intelligence was focused on trying to decode his stories, the Federation fleet launched their final coordinated attack. Ships moved into positions that made no logical sense, but created perfect tactical opportunities. The hidden allied species struck from directions the machines had not calculated, and Jake continued telling stories that kept the artificial intelligence distracted and confused. When the last Harvest Fleet ship was destroyed, the entire Federation fleet was silent for a long moment. Then Jake heard something he had never heard before. Beings from 50 different species cheering in languages that ranged from musical tones to electronic whistles, but all expressing the same emotion of victory and relief. Admiral Martinez put her hand on Jake's shoulder. "Officer Morrison, I'm promoting you to Senior Communication Strategist for the entire Federation fleet. We're going to need your methods for future operations." But it was Zixara who said the words that meant the most to Jake. "Morrison," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. When I first heard your accent, I thought it meant you were uneducated and primitive. I was wrong. Your accent represents something beautiful and important that my people have lost. You speak with the voice of your home, your family, your history. That's not primitive. That's wisdom." Jake smiled and looked out at the stars where the Federation fleet was beginning to regroup. "Ma'am, I reckon there's room in this galaxy for all kinds of voices. Sometimes the most important thing ain't